problem with the submarine portion of AUKUS is it's logistically challenged. And I think we're going to hear Brian explain in what way. Now, given the history of this submarine effort in Australia, which has been ill-starred for several decades, it's not been just recently. I mean, it's the Collins class effort has not exactly been smooth sailing. If you read and know anything about it, they've had difficulties with their submarines. And of course, we don't have to explain, I hope, the misadventure of the French engagement, which, my guess is everyone gave it the office on this one. But, part of the problem is what we're discovering. Once you get into one of these things, you keep changing the terms of what it is you're going to deliver and when. And I think the French surely, filled out that attribute. And so, what happened to the French, I mean, could conceivably happen to the Americans, And I think it'd be useful to kind of, after all the blood that's been let out diplomatically about breaking that contract off, I think it's time to start talking again about what can happen, and actually think maybe even positively. It could be that the French can help. Now, it may well be politically that's not so sensible to try to do just now, but last I checked, this project is going to go on forever. I mean, how many decades does this thing go on? So, with a sense of humor, I thought we ought to open it up at the very time that, they announced it. Now, I have to be honest, I think Brian and I were convinced we were geniuses coming up with this topic, and then thought we were idiots once the thing was announced. But I always say, stick to your flight plan. If there's any merit to this, we'll find out. So tonight, what I'd like to do is have Brian kind of lay the sort of the foundation of the problem, and maybe discuss, his thoughts on things that might be helpful. The problem, roughly, is we're going to have a hard time delivering those Virginia-class submarines. That's not going to be so easy. We're kind of tapped out, last I checked. Now, Brian comes to this. I mean, I think, I suspect we sent out the bio, but if we didn't, let's just say that underneath that flinty exterior of general infielding expertise is a submariner, and someone who actually worked in the Navy quite a lot. And so he's not just another talking head, although we certainly are amazed at how many topics he can cover. But he actually really knows something about submarines. So I would say he's an expert. And you know what an expert is? It's someone who has a lot of experience, and experience is what you get when you don't exactly get what you want. I mean, you did leave the Navy, so there must have been some truth to your expertise on that front. So why don't we first listen to him, and then we have Mr. Bondaz, who is coming all the way from France tonight, and I think comes to this topic unweighted by the technical, logistical specifics of things, but a pretty solid knowledge of how France looks at the Pacific and what it sees as its equities, and probably knows, I suspect, a great deal about the diplomatic history of the submarine contract and how all that unfolded. I think, with this combination, we can get an insight into what we can learn from what didn't work out, to what extent we may be subject to it, and to what extent perhaps the French later can come in and maybe help make this submarine deal work better, maybe even just work. So Brian, why don't we lead with you? And I'm really interested to see how this unfolds. This one's for us, if no one else.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Henry.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm glad you're all here. Thanks for being here tonight. Henry didn't mention I was just in Australia last week in
Oh,
support of an AUKUS related study that we're doing with the US Navy on unmanned systems. So I got to get an earful from various Australian officials about AUKUS and what they see as the future and what their concerns are. And I'll say that, people in government were all very supportive. People that were not in government anymore were less universally supportive. And I'll bring those points up. So the current approach that the U.S. and Australia have worked out, the drug deal that them and the British and the Australians have worked out is that UK and US submarines will begin doing port calls this year to Australia to the submarine port that's in Stirling, HMAS Stirling, which is over by Perth on the western coast of Australia. So they'll begin doing these port calls with more frequency. It's very infrequent that we send submarines there today. And that will be a starting point to begin doing some cooperative training where Australian sailors will begin going to sea on US submarines and UK submarines to begin getting the experience of operating a nuclear submarine. Both at the forward end, which is not nuclear powered, or is nuclear powered, but there's nuclear reactors out there, and then also the aft end where the nuclear propulsion plant is. And then Australian sailors are also going to be going through the training pipelines of the UK and US, starting with the UK and then later the US. Then the transition will happen between now and 2027, approximately. So during that time frame, Australia will begin developing the maintenance infrastructure in the Perth area to support nuclear submarines rather than the Collins class submarines that they currently support. So building that maintenance infrastructure in the vicinity of Perth will be a really large undertaking. So you're talking about 1,000 plus people, workers being necessary for this maintenance facility. You need the docks and the infrastructure and all that. So it's a sizable undertaking just to build and establish this maintenance capacity in Western Australia, which Western Australia is more than happy to provide because the mining industry has really suffered some downturns as a result of the China-Australia trade war that's gone on for the last several years. So the mining interests out there are looking for a new way to make money, and the workers there are looking for new ways to get jobs. And so there's a sort of a very good opportunity here for everybody to kind of win as a result of this maintenance facility being established in Western Australia. And then you'd have US submarines begin doing rotational deployments out of HMAS Stirling. So US nuclear submarines would begin to be based there on what the US calls a rotational basis, meaning they would deploy and then maybe do a crew swap out there. So the crews and their families would stay back here in the United States, but the ships would maybe go through a couple of deployments remaining over in Australia. So the submarine deployment's normally 6 months. They might do like 2 4-month deployments or something like that. So the ship would go out there, hang out in Australia for 8 months or maybe a little bit more, and then crews would go out and rotate there at the ship. So it's a little bit unclear at this point exactly how it's going to work because our attack submarines do not have multiple crews right now. So it's unclear whether they'll actually give them multiple crews or if they'll just have the submarine stay out there with their crew and then come home after some extended deployment. That's yet to be worked out. But I would say that whole first 2 phases, the port calls and then this rotational deployment, are pretty feasible. So even if Australia doesn't come through on the infrastructure and the manpower necessary to maintain nuclear submarines, the US could take one of the submarine tenders that it has in Guam, there's 2 there, and move it to Australia to take that, to provide that capability, which would allow them to do this rotational deployment out of Stirling, even without the benefit of an Australian infrastructure. The US in this year's defense budget added an additional submarine tender, partly for this purpose, so that there would be an additional tender that could be sent to Australia in theory if it was needed, which means that that first couple of phases is pretty feasible. I don't see there being a lot of downside really for anybody in doing this. The US benefits from having forward deployed submarines that are that much closer to potential areas of operation. Australia benefits obviously from having all these jobs. It also gives Australia some additional submarine capacity by extension, via the US fleet that's going to be based there. Then it starts to get, then that's where the plan begins to start to get a little hairy because the plan would then be for Australia to over time, begin to take up more and more crew positions in U.S. submarines, U.S. Virginia class submarines, which would be operating out of Sterling. So the crews would have this small contingent of Australian sailors, which would grow over time until the U.S. felt like those sailors and the overall maintenance capacity and the oversight capacity of the Australian Navy was such that they're ready to take the training wheels off and get their own submarines. And then they would buy Virginia class submarines from the United States. Those Virginia class submarines they would buy, which would be now into the 2030s, we're talking early 2030s, would be used submarines. So they're going to be not fresh off the lot. They'll have been broken in, and they might be in the 10-year-old time frame, which means they have about 20 years left on them. So from the Australian perspective, that's great. You get the benefit of a lower price. It's certified used, and you can get it and probably for a lower price than you'd pay new. The downside, is that they're submarines that have 20 years of service left on them. In theory, they are not designed to be refueled. Something like that. They're not designed to be refueled, and so that might mean there's a limit on how long they could use them. And then also, there's a big question in the U.S. as to whether Australia is going to be really ready to take the training wheels off and make this transition from having Australian sailors on U.S. submarines using the U.S. oversight infrastructure with naval reactors and the U.S. maintenance infrastructure that's provided via the tenders and everything, to transitioning to an Australian sovereign submarine capability. And even in Australia, I asked this question, and folks were not entirely confident by the 2030s that they would be able to really have built up their own naval reactors, their own maintenance architecture, their whole everything independent of the United States. They might be still dependent upon the United States for some of that support. So there would have to be some way to work that arrangement out. And then this transition to actually buying submarines, there's a question among Labour Party, which is the more liberal party in Australia, Labour Party leaders as to whether the country is really willing to pay this kind of money for used submarines in this case, which are going to be upward of $2.5 billion a piece American, which would be a sizable portion of the Australian defense budget each year that they buy one. So a sizable cost entailed there for a submarine that's going to last 20 years or so. So there's a big question as whether they're going to actually buy this 3 to 5 submarines that the U.S. would sell them. And now in the U.S., and I was talking to a member of Congress this morning, there's also some resistance to selling these submarines because, as Henry noted, the U.S. can't build any more submarines any faster. So these submarines are going to come out of the U.S. inventory and not really be replaced. And so the U.S. is going to have to give up 3 to 5 submarines from its inventory to Australia. And you can make a strategic case for this, why that's beneficial to the U.S., because it gets them forward, it improves the alliance, it strengthens our deterrence against China as a group. But it does mean they're out of the U.S. inventory, and there's a certain prestige associated with that. That's probably something that leaders here are concerned about. So there's some question in Australia and in the U.S. as to whether we're going to actually sell these submarines to Australia and give them this sovereign capability. And then at some point, even farther into the future, in the late 2030s, early 2040s, Australia would buy in co-development with the UK, UK submarines coming off the line, which are the Astute replacements, which would be called SSN AUKUS, as opposed to the successor class, which is what I think the UK was thinking about calling those. So I think that's actually not, that might be a really feasible option for Australia to look at just going in with the UK and joining forces and basically taking those UK submarines off the line, and maybe even having some Australia built components in them to get a little bit of Australia content. But I think it's this middle part, this phase 3, as I might call it, where they buy and are given US submarines, that I think is the most problematic. And that's where you get into the French option. And I think the Barracuda or the Suffren class submarines that the French are building right now, they finish construction in the 2029 timeframe, 2029, 2030, depending how it goes, which means that they would be finishing up construction of those right around the same time Australia would be looking to buy either US submarines or somebody else's. The Suffren class is probably going to be cheaper than a Virginia class. It'll be new, certainly. And then the one advantage that Australian leaders noted to me was by using low enriched uranium, it leverages the entire fuel cycle that's available from France, and along with their civilian nuclear industry. So in France, the nuclear submarine force uses essentially the same regulatory regime as the civilian nuclear power industry, which is a nice synergy, and that might help in Australia with regard to concerns regarding proliferation, which I think are dumb because the uranium that's inside of a nuclear reactor on a submarine is not very accessible, very difficult to repurpose into a weapon, but just the same, it's a concern. But I think even more important is the fact that they would be able to leverage France's whole infrastructure for sustaining and maintaining a nuclear submarine. And they maybe were willing to have French help doing that than feel like they're on a tether with the United States. I did get in Australia a real sense of concern on the part of the Australians that we're just going to be basically puppets of the United States because we're going to be beholden to them for the regulatory architecture, the naval reactors, all that stuff that comes with a U.S. nuclear submarine. Where with France, we may be able to be more independent. And I'll stop there. So.
Well, the idea of choosing your master, I suppose, makes your choice, no matter how bad it is, look more attractive. Whereas if they had no choice at all, that's an interesting point. I never really thought of that. Antoine?
Yeah, I mean, it's always better to have a weak master than a strong one.
Well, yes, or at least.
I mean, I would have just one question before
Yes, go ahead.
commenting. So it would basically mean that no Virginia being acquired, secondhand Virginia being acquired by the Australians. But what about the AUKUS submarine in 2040? It will still be AUKUS submarine, right?
Brian?
Yeah, I think you could still have AUKUS, SSN AUKUS in the 2040s timeframe. So Australia could buy 3 to 5 Suffren class submarines and still be in on SSN AUKUS, which I still think is a good idea for them to get at the ground floor of a new submarine program and be able to kind of build it to address their particular needs and basically have the whole maintenance infrastructure designed around that, as opposed to having in the case of either way, they're going to have multiple different classes of submarines. But this way, at least their long-term plan would be.
I can't resist
UK
observing that the Australians might, under this scheme, be dependent on the French, but the British in the civil sector would be entirely hostage by then to EDF. And that perhaps with the passage of as many years as 10, what it is that will look toxic to cooperate on will be very different. I mean, it's a lot of time. It's almost politically interesting amounts of time. Over to you.
Yeah, so to get back on more of the political aspects, I'm not going to tell you I have any solution or any recommendation, but I think there are some political constraints we need to live with. Overall, French policy in the Indo-Pacific has basically two objectives. To promote our interests through differentiating ourselves from the Anglo-Saxons. And even though it's not said publicly, this is one of the objectives, while cooperating with you and more broadly with everyone. So the "we are different" card is key in French foreign policy. So we might criticize it. I'm not always fine with it, but this is one of the constraints self-imposed by many French politicians, including by the president. That's why, even though the president will not say it publicly, the idea of a third way, etc., is still something he believes in. He understands that to say it publicly is a problem and that he will never say it publicly. But this is something he thinks about. So anything related to AUKUS right now is kind of toxic, in a sense that being too close to the US, too close to the UK, even too close to Australia in a way on these military stuff could be seen as toxic. That's why, let's take something quite recent, in the France-UK joint statement following the summit between Sunak and Macron, you have actually very limited stuff on the Indo-Pacific. You have the idea of a coordinated maritime presence, something that the French have been putting forward since 2016, when the UK was still part of the EU, when Le Drian basically was pushing for it as Minister of Armed Forces back then, Minister of Defense. It was not even called Ministry of Armed Forces. So basically on that, the main problem of the French is we can cooperate, but we cannot make it too public. And one of my recommendations ahead of the summit, France-UK summit, was to the British, because I discussed it a lot with the British, including the team negotiating the summit, etc., coordinating the summit. Don't expect too much on the Indo-Pacific. I mean, we know this is one of your priority. We know that you have expectation. And of course, there is a great potential of cooperation between France and the UK and the Indo-Pacific. And you are a much more natural partner than Germany, of course. But publicly, in terms of strategic and political stuff, there are constraints on the French side. Once again, I mean, I don't think this is smart constraint. I think it's self-imposed, etc., but that's the reality. So starting from that, anything that would align in the French sense of the term, because for us, I know that in English, when you say, oh, if you are ally, of course you're aligned. But the French term align is very negative. You're aligned being you're just a follower. So that's why, you know, I know that the French element langage always say we are ally, but not align. And we think it's very smart because in French, it sounds smart. We know that in English, it doesn't mean anything. So that's why we keep saying, no, just say we are aside, not behind. I mean, find something else, but not the ally, allied, not aligned. So on that, anything that would push France in terms of the way we position ourselves in the region, too close to AUKUS, too close to the US, would not be the chosen solution or the chosen option. You can sit with all of the discussion about the Quad. I mean, some of us have been advocating for France not to join the Quad, because I think we will never join the Quad, but to join some working groups of the Quad. Working groups on vaccine and infrastructure, something that are not even security related, that are very, the least political sensitive. Even that, it's complicated. And when you just say, maybe we could join some working group because it makes sense, you are being labeled, or you are pro-US, you're just an Atlantist, blah, 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 to discredit people. So this is one of the biggest constraints. How can France get closer to Australia, including on some technologies, submarine technologies, while not being seen, or at least not presenting itself as aligning on the US, or getting too close to the US on that aspect? That's important, not only because many French officials believe in it, believe in a so-called third way, even though they don't say it publicly, but also because they are convinced that if we want to maintain some of our arms exports to key countries, India, Indonesia, United Arab Emirates, we need to keep playing the card of we are not the US. We are not even Anglo-Saxon. We are a bit different. And we have an added value. We have a position that is maybe not unique, but at least different. So when we get back to the submarine, the only question I would have to Brian is, how do we combine the two? It's kind of the en même temps from Macron, is how do you have at the same time a possibility for us to keep differentiating from the US and the Anglo-Saxon, while cooperating and agreeing on something with the Australians. Second, it might be in 10 years, but will France be ready to transfer some technologies, or at least some nuclear-propelled submarine? We can believe and we can imagine that in 10 years' time, I mean, there might be an agreement with Brazil. I don't think South Korea, because of China, basically. So I don't think that the French might do it with South Korea. But if Brazil, if United Arab Emirates were willing to discuss it, I think there might be countries in which we could have kind of a discussion, or at least there could be kind of a discussion, much more easily than other countries in which exporting this kind of submarine would be seen as being too hostile to China. Not because France is not serious on China. I mean, we are the only European countries to send nuclear submarine in South China Sea, to send our intelligence Navy ship in the Taiwan Strait. So, I mean, we're not being weak on China. But still, in the official discourse and speeches, there is the idea that we need to position not against China, not in the middle of the US and China. I mean, we're not equidistant, but at least to be different. So my point on that political aspect and the idea, of course, is to discuss it with you is how do you find a solution that is, I'm not talking at all, because Brian mentioned it, about the technical solution, but a political solution, because at the end of the day, it's a highly political one, in which France can still have this kind of very unique and differentiated position while providing potentially something to the Australians. And I think this is a very, very difficult equation. And I don't think that in the coming year, the equation is going to change a lot. Macron is going to remain until 2027. We have no idea who will be the next president, but it won't be Macron. Whether there will be a U-turn in terms of foreign policy, we don't know. But for sure, if the far left or the far right is being elected, and if they elect a president, I mean, they get a president elected, we might have some surprise in terms of political positioning and kind of a U-turn from previous practices. But short of that, there will be kind of a continuity, because you had a continuity de facto between Macron, Hollande, Sarkozy. It was not a big change, on these kind of issues. So my question to you all is, how do you find kind of the via media and the solution in which you have this kind of political constraints being taken into consideration, and the technical needs and the operational need that Brian mentioned before? And I don't have the solution. I didn't think of it enough, for sure. And I think it would be great to have all of your comments on that.
By the way, before we open it up for suggestions, Eisenhower was reported to have said something which seemed an awful lot smarter than what I assessed him to be after having spent 6 years reading everything I could about Eisenhower. So maybe he didn't say it, but it's an interesting thought. And the thought is, when you have a particularly impossible situation or a problem, what you need to do is expand the problem so it's much bigger. Now, I don't know what that precisely means, but the idea that we need to focus very much on the next year or two is absurd.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean that's a given. Don't even waste your time. But the idea that you might imagine some future political situation, both in France and how it sees China's activities differently over the next decade, that's more interesting. So why don't we, I mean, it could be that we don't know what the solution is, because the problem right now is very narrow and small, how to lick your wounds for some really rough treatment over a contract and disagreements with a political figure who was there at the time. But all that may change if the problem changes. and gets bigger or it is different. And maybe we should open that up for folks to suggest how the problem may change in such a way that what looks impossible now and is politically might look very different.
Yeah, but and on that, I would say, let's imagine that before the 2030s, France decide to export nuclear propelled submarine. We will have de facto limited amount of submarine to export.
Right.
Do we decide to export them to Australia or to other countries in the region?
No. You're quite good and clear on the improbability of this, but it's very important to think if something is important and in its state, well, at the margin.
Sure.
At the margin. I mean, this meeting is at the margin after all.
But it's a good one because it's a brainstorming, so that's why it's
exciting. Yes. Well, we'll see how much storming or brains there are here. I'm trying not to interject my own views, but rather try to elicit others who are quietly hiding their faces behind initials to reveal themselves and their thoughts or questions. And of course, in a pinch, I can actually call on people, but let's see whether someone might volunteer first. It's awfully quiet out there. This is not right.
Maybe I have a question to Brian. I mean,
okay, yes. Why don't you at least interrogate one another?
Yeah, how many Suffren class submarines do you think that Australia would need in the 2030s? Because it's supposed to be 3 to 5, right, Virginia?
Correct.
The deal? Okay.
Yeah, so 3 to 5 submarines, and I would say that the operational, the numbers would be about the same for the Suffren. It's about the same, size, capacity of submarine compared to a Virginia of the kind that the Australians would want. So I think it'd be about the same.
Now, given the size of this group, I think you can just raise your hand. I don't think you have to go through the rigmarole of going to the chat room. Here we go. Matthew? There you are.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me?
You look extremely high tech there, well heeled, putting all of us to shame.
Thanks. Well, so I'm another French, and I can basically echo every word of what Antoine said on I think the political constraints, and I think with this administration, with the Macron government, you should not expect any change, at least until that makes us into 2027. And I also agree with Antoine that whatever figure that might emerge after Macron might not be more Atlanticist, but this is too early to say. But yeah, I agree that there is also the trade interest that Antoine mentioned, that he called self-imposed constraint, but we are also reaping benefits of these constraints in terms of industrial prospects with the countries that you mentioned, like India, Indonesia, and this is probably here to stay too. But that being said, I think the toxicity of being aligned, appearing aligned, is more tied to the US or the UK, and much less with Australia. Australia has always been identified as a key partner. At the time when Macron launched its French Indo-Pacific strategy, he talked about a Delhi-Canberra axis. And so I guess if it's difficult to envision anything in the AUKUS framework, I think at the bilateral relation with Australia and including now is on a very good footing, and it might expand in the coming years. So there's probably something that can be knitted, but would the UK and the US be fine with something that is only at a bilateral level? And then I have also a technical question. It's just on the time frame, because as I mentioned, it's hard to envision anything before 2027. But there's also the question that I think Brian Clark raised on the fact that the crews will need to be trained on the submarines, and this takes time. And so even if we think of a delivery in 2029 of Suffren class submarine, so I guess we would need to start also another cycle of training and the crew being able to operate it. So that would probably delay it. I don't know. I have no idea on the time frame, but I guess that would bring us closer to the expected time frame for the SSN AUKUS to come in. So I wonder how the time frame is compatible. Thank you.
Brian, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. So I would say that on the manpower front, one of the significant concerns in the U.S. is not so much the crews, because there's a pretty much a confidence that the crews will be able to get trained up, but that there's not going to be that upper level management that's nuclear trained or nuclear cognizant that you have in the U.S. So in the U.S. system, head of naval reactors who's a 4-star admiral, and then all the way down, there's multiple levels of chain of command and organization that are thinking about managing the nuclear enterprise and ensuring that it's operated safely. So in Australia, you wouldn't have that. You would have some crews and maybe a commanding officer for those ships, those submarines that would be coming out of the nuclear power training program, but you wouldn't have this upper level of management. And so there's a concern that when we get to the time frame when they're going to start to buy submarines, is Australia really going to have that, organizational wherewithal, or do they just have a bunch of crews that are trained up that might be able to take ownership of the boats? Which means that Australia is then really just beholden to the United States when it comes to operation of those ships. So that's a concern that's going to likely delay, I think, the actual selling of ships to the Australians. And then that, I think you're right that if it stretches long enough, you might find yourself, buying a couple of submarines and then moving right into SSN AUKUS, and then you've got this really mixed fleet. And that's a concern on the part of both the U.S. and Australia, is you end up with this very heterogeneous submarine fleet that's hard to manage. So that's a concern. That's one of the things that might be driving, in the Australian mind, consideration of alternatives to get nuclear submarines, faster, maybe without the same organizational headaches they might have with the U.S.
You keep in mind, most people don't know this, but the nuclear navy in the U.S. oversees a fleet of reactors larger in number than the civil sector in the United States. It's, as our former president sometimes would say, huge. It's not just a few things. It's an enormous, infrastructure. And I'm sure the French have discovered that fielding their submarines is not a small undertaking either. It demands a certain amount of obedience and a lot of support. But I'm curious, do people how do the French, other than selling things, how do the French talk about the Pacific and Western Pacific region? Do they rationalize in some Cartesian fashion why they need to be there?
At the highest level, the question is not whether we should be there, is that we are there, and what can we do over there. 4 out of our 13 overseas territories are in the Pacific. New Caledonia, French Polynesia, of course, Wallis and Futuna, and Clipperton. But of course, the first two are by far the most important. For many years, and even honestly at the beginning when the strategy was announced, these territories were instrumental to legitimize us because we were an Indo-Pacific power. We are there. So of course it was legitimate for us to have a strategy. Whether these territories were fully integrated, valued, promoted within the strategy, I'm not sure. But that's an internal French problem. There's much more we can do to promote and center our strategy on our territories. Then on the Pacific, there is currently a drive to do much more. The Office for Oceanian Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been upgraded to a subdirectorate. Same level as subdirectorate for Northeast Asia, for Southeast Asia, and for South Asia. Among the Europeans, we are the only one to have 3+2 embassies in the region. So Fiji, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, Australia, and New Zealand. You have a French ambassador dedicated to the Pacific. She's in charge of cooperation in the Pacific, even though she's based in Paris. Stupid. I agree. But her husband is an MP and she wanted to be based in Paris. That's one of the reasons. So the French are doing a lot, and we have upgraded our game, including through some key initiatives like Kiwa on biodiversity, with Canada, with Australia, with New Zealand, and with the EU. And we are doing a lot on where we have an added value. We have an added value on, for example, HADR, especially the DR. This is what's happening in Vanuatu right now. That's not the Australians, that's not the US helping Vanuatu first. It was the French, because we are closer geographically with New Caledonia. So we were the first one to get there and help them basically resume normal activities, projecting forces for disaster relief and assistance. So the French have kind of weird dynamics in which we do a lot, with very limited capabilities, we need to be honest. We want to do more, yet we lack the highest political signal. And I will be honest with that. I was with the president 10 days ago because we were discussing the visit to China. And I told him, I mean, like, come on, I mean, never a French president, never ever a French Minister of Foreign Affairs has ever been in the South Pacific. I mean, in South Pacific island states. Of course, Macron has been to New Caledonia and Polynesia, of course. But never a French president or French Minister of Foreign Affairs has ever been to Fiji, Vanuatu, or Palau, or Nauru, or Micronesia, etc. Never. And I told him it doesn't make any sense. We are, I mean, the MOFA, the MOD, everyone is doing a lot in the Pacific. You have high ambitions. We are putting capacities, fundings, yet there is no visit. That's a problem. So the Secretary of State visited, but she's not high level enough, I would say. So, but it's still positive. She went to Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, but we are expecting the President or the Minister of Foreign Affairs to go. So on that, to be honest, South Pacific is being seen from the French lens as, and where we have the added value is mostly on climate change, biodiversity, disaster relief, etc. On the purely military part, we need to be honest. I mean, I will be blunt because we don't even have the capabilities to make sure we can monitor our EEZ in French Polynesia. So are we going to go help the other countries to monitor their own EEZ when we cannot even have, I mean, we don't even have the resources, the full resources to do our own job? So on that, I will be very honest saying that it's not on the military, purely military side that we have an added value or that the French expect to do much more. It's on the environmental security, so disaster relief, climate change, etc. On humanitarian stuff, etc. for sure. But on the purely military stuff, I mean, it's too early to tell. We will see in a few months when we have the new law on the budget for the army for the next 5 years, the loi de programmation militaire. So we will see what has been decided, but don't expect, I don't know, an helicopter carrier to be projected like the Dixmude, because the Dixmude is right now between Singapore and Indonesia, I think, on the Jeanne d'Arc mission, etc. So it's great, but don't expect one of the 3 boats to be permanently stationed in the South Pacific. So this is the limitation we have. So I talked about the political constraints before. This is kind of the economic constraints we have. So within this framework, the question is, how do we do better? To get a French president visit, to get more partnership, to get more initiative, that's something we can do. To expect something too big, it's maybe so far, and I hope it's going to change, a bit unrealistic in the very short term.
Okay, that was a bit of a long answer. Question. The Americans and the British, certainly in the short run, are forbidden interlocutors in public about certain kinds of defense cooperation. But you have left open one of the culprits that cut the contract, and you seem to be warm and friendly to that still, and that is Australia, which is interesting, maybe because it's a smaller country. But what kinds of requests for assistance would be seen as attractive, and what kinds of requests for military assistance, and focusing on the naval and the submarine dimension, would be seen as toxic, and why? From Australia, never mind the other. The others would not necessarily be in the picture.
Honestly, I think anything not directly related to the submarine itself would be fine. And tomorrow, the Australians come about surface vessels, even some submarine technologies. Not sure the French would veto it, or would just block it. That's prospect for industrial exports, prospect to rebuild, or I mean, many projects are still not going. I mean, we need to be honest, everything was not cut off, 18 months ago. But I think on many aspects, if the Australians were willing, the French side could be very responsive. And even Naval Group. I think the idea that because of what happened, Naval Group will never do anything again in Australia, of course not. They could. So far, and it was a problem basically the month following AUKUS, the French were expecting the Australians not to apologize. It's not about apologies, but what do they expect? What are they ready to put on the table? What do they want at the end? And the Australians were expecting the same from the French. Basically, what do you want from us to move forward? So, of course, with the Labour getting elected, with Albanese meeting Macron, everything is easier. They get along very well. When they met in July in Paris, it went well. The president might go in the coming month, etc. There will be a roadmap. But once again, on industrial, on defense industry cooperation, I think the French are very open. Very open. It will depend on what the Australians ask. But I think, I don't know whether Mathieu has another opinion on that, but I think the French remain very open on that.
Brian, do you have any thoughts? This is a little bit open-ended. So there even was the uttering of submarine technology. What in the world? Is there really a there here that one can imagine? Don't jump to your microphone immediately. Brian, do you hear me?
Yeah. So
okay.
I think there's an opportunity. I think there's an opportunity here for France's to take advantage of. I think what's going to happen is there'll be a bogging down of the AUKUS plan in the the late 2020s. The U.S. will deploy submarines there. They'll be operating out of Perth. They'll have probably a tender there to support them as the Australians build up the infrastructure. And then, well, when are we ready to start, taking these submarines to the Australians? I think there's going to be a lot of resistance on all sides because they won't quite be there from a training perspective or a infrastructure perspective. The US will not feel like they're there from an organizational perspective. Australians are going to resist it from just the cost of the submarines. So I think there's going to be a lot of factors that drive, a slowing down of this plan in the late 2020s. And there's an opportunity for France to come in and offer a solution and kind of be the savior of this, Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific effort around submarines. So to me, that's the opportunity that France has that they can take advantage of in that late 2020s time frame. And post there's going to be a new president, obviously, in France at that time. So it depends on how that turns out. But I think that's the opportunity, and that's what likely the challenge is going to be for the U.S. and Australia.
Maybe, okay. Well, now we've sparked interest. Tom Countryman, why don't you take, and then we'll go to Leah.
Okay. Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Brian, and everyone who's commented. It's fascinating. I happen to be back in government when the AUKUS announcement was made 18 months ago. Now I'm back out of government, where my colleagues at the Arms Control Association worry about the non-proliferation implications of the entire deal. I have to say, I don't worry about that. I have confidence that the Atomic Energy Agency can do this right in a way that does not set a wrong precedent for other countries that may be considering this. But when I first heard the announcement, without being an expert on submarines, I immediately thought of about 10 different ways that this could go off the rails. And I wondered, as I think some of us still wonder, if it ever will fully reach the ambitions of the initial announcement. And so I wanted to ask Brian a very general, kind of squishy question, which is, it seems to me that with all the announcements made by the two prime ministers and the president this month, I don't think very many questions got answered. And some of them perhaps raised more questions. So my general question, Brian, is, do you feel like we understand this a lot better and have more confidence in its future than we did before that summit meeting this month? Thanks.
Good question. So within the nuclear power community, the nuclear propulsion community, I would say this was exactly what we expected. So when I would talk to my submariner colleagues, we all had this as the AUKUS plan they laid out was essentially the plan we assumed that they would go with. And I think it's done on purpose to be a kind of a crawl, walk, run type of approach, that the first phase is almost, it's just very easy. No, there's no question you can do port calls in Australia. And then the second phase is even not that hard, as you do rotational deployments and have some submarines, based there on a periodic basis. But then it starts to get harder. So they deliberately put these harder parts later on. And then you've got this, period with essentially training wheels to allow the US to evaluate whether Australia is really up to it or not. So I think what they've done is just sort of push out the more uncertain aspects of it into the future, which is prudent from an engineering perspective, but also means that it's unclear whether any of this, except for the initial phases, will ever really come to pass. So yeah, I think the plan is exactly what we expected, but it reflects this sort of engineering mindset of let's burn down risk by doing this in a phased approach that allows us to evaluate each step of the way whether we're ready for the next step.
Okay. Leah, why don't we give you the microphone?
Sure, thank you.
Okay.
I do wonder if during that training wheel period or immediately after, there's not an opportunity for some joint French-Australian naval exercises. The French are not new to naval exercises in the Indo-Pacific. They just finished, I think, the 21st Varuna in January between France and India. And so that could be an opportunity as the Americans sort of disengage from actually interacting that much with the submarines for the Australian submarines to get some training opportunities and some drill opportunities with the French Navy in the region.
Is that a question?
I think it was so. I think a couple of things there. So, obviously the French and the Australians with the Collins class submarines that the Australians currently have could do some exercises, but there are already some of those exercises happening. So I think that could be certainly accelerated. And I think for the French and Australians and Americans to cooperate on submarine operations, perhaps in the mid 2020s when they're starting to be U.S. submarines actually operating or based out of there. Just one thing though is that the French doesn't send very many submarines over to the Indo-Pacific as it is. So those for the UK either, right? So these east of Suez deployments are pretty infrequent. So they can do a big exercise once in a while, but it's not something where you're going to get a lot of opportunities necessarily.
So we've just increased the submarine touring requirements of the French submarine force.
No, but on these Navy exercises in 2024, the French should send an air defense frame, the new frigates, air defense frigate we have. So Alsace and the second one, I don't remember the name because it's not yet finished, but one of them should go to RIMPAC in 2024. The demonstration of French commitment to contribute to these kind of exercises, military exercises, etc. So there will be something. Whether the French should send one day a nuclear attack submarine to join an exercise, either in the Indian Ocean or more, I mean, yeah, that's a good question.
I guess the wicking hour of 1 full hour has come to pass. I never like to extend virtual reality beyond the market that has to bear it. But let me make a general plea first. Does anyone have a comment or a question? The door is still open. Well, Brian, we had talked about possibly focusing on a different way of doing cooperation in the military area, and in fact in the naval area in particular, instead of the United States figuring out or Europe figuring out how it can collaborate with actors in the Western Pacific. Maybe it should be the other way around. In particular, there is at least an argument for Japanese and South Korean shipbuilding in the commercial sector somehow informing the lethargic shipbuilding practices in this antiquated country called the United States. And we were thinking of standing that up. Did you have a chance to talk with our potential presenter about that, Brian?
Yes, so we can do that that would be a good topic, and we do have a couple of presenters that are on tap that would be willing to participate. So that definitely is something we could do.
I have to say that the character of the Pax Pacifica series Brian and I are always straining to take the thought of collaboration and cooperation to a new level where we're not treating countries that we're working with as protectorates. Americans like doing that, but I don't think that's sustainable. But I do sense in many respects that the penalty for free thinking is getting ahead of where everyone are right now, where everyone is. And that may be, but I think it's important to start thinking about these things seriously if the competition with China really is going to last a long time and be allied in some fashion with Russia. And I mean, if this is a serious long-term competition, I think we need to be a little more open to things that maybe seem a little odd at first. anyway, that's the spirit in which this forum is going to try to operate more often than not. And with that, I guess the smart thing is to thank you all right now, and make sure that we get in touch with you so you can come back for the next episode. And on that note, I bid you all a good evening.